Hello and a very, very warm welcome to our live stream all about the 2023 Talos Year in Review. Forget your Spotify Unwrapped. This is the definitive 2023 list that you're going to want to pay attention to if you're a security nerd like us. So the Talos team has once again sat down to dive into the huge amount of data to analyze the major trends in the cybersecurity threat landscape of 2023. So we're going to discuss what those trends are, what's new, what's stayed the same, and how the geopolitical environment has affected the threat landscape. And also, of course, what are our recommendations for security defenders in the year ahead. So we'll be taking your questions throughout. So if you have something that you'd like to ask us about the report, drop your question into the comments, or if you're watching us on X, just reply to the stream. So joining me today are three of my Talos colleagues. We've got Dave Liebenberg, who heads up our strategic analysis team, and this is the team that wrote the report. Also joining me is Laurie Varner, who is one of our incident commanders. She helps our customers deal with any cybersecurity incidents, but also incident response planning as well. And last but certainly not least, we have Nick Biasini, who is the head of our Talos outreach team. And their job is to research and detect the latest threats, and then, of course, make sure that the community is fully aware of them. So if you haven't got your copy yet of the Year in Review, you can download this now. It is cs.co/Talos Year in Review, and we will drop that link into the comments. So let's get right into it. Dave, I'm going to come to you first. I always think this is really interesting to let people know about, because we really do cover a wide basis of threats in the report. So what data did you and your team look at when it comes to compiling the research for this report?
Sure. So it's almost easier to say what we didn't draw on because Cisco has access to such vast resources and we leveraged everything that we could. So that includes telemetry sets like network traffic, endpoint detections, our email corpus, our sandboxes, on and on. And not to mention the great work from teams that we work with here at Talos. From IR, we use them in a lot of different instances, and outreach gave us amazing insight into APT research and things like that. So it's really a broad swath and one of the riches that we have when putting together a report such as this, and also one of the challenges because the amount of data is just dizzying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we cover major trends, ransomware and extortion, APTs, as you said, network infrastructure, and also commodity loaders as well. So there's a lot to digest. If you could pick, Dave, one key theme from this year's report, what would it be?
So, thematically, I think what unites all of that is we're continuing to see the complexity and intensity of various geopolitical conflicts manifest themselves in the cyber threat space. So, this is, of course, something you'd expect for APTs, but we see it even broader than that with cybercrime and ransomware as well. So, that influence, disruption, the ensuing adaptation from threat actors and defenders is something that broadly unites all the key trends we've observed this year. And in terms of trends, top of mind for me is the targeting of network devices and the targeting of telecoms.
Yeah, definitely. We're going to come on to that in a little bit. The first topic that we deep dive on, though, is ransomware. Certainly some interesting changes this year, some things that have stayed the same, and some things that we saw several years back come back to reintroduce themselves. Laurie, I want to talk to you a little bit about this. We talk about how, the ransomware is still there, but there's also this trend going more towards pure extortion and kind of getting rid of the encryption part of ransomware. Can you talk about this rising trend and generally what you're seeing as an incident commander in the field?
Yeah, definitely. The ransomware is still everywhere, and we are seeing that. We've seen that dual tap, that double tap kind of thing, where they're going to do the ransom for the extortion, or the ransom for the encryption, which we all know and love. But now we've got the exfiltration bit, and they're asking for two different amounts of money. I think, though, we're like you said, we're seeing them kind of focus more on the exfiltration. It's more stealthy. It's not easily seen. You know, a lot of folks aren't able to kind of capture that telemetry to see that. So it kind of goes unnoticed a lot more than some of the louder regular ransomware encryption activities. So we're definitely seeing more and more of that. But on the flip side, I think too, our customers are paying more attention. They've got stronger security tools. So the extortion bit is happening and our customers are seeing the effect of that. But when the louder portions for, say, the encryption activities start to come along, we're seeing our customers stopping that before it gets to that point. So that is the good news of it, is we're seeing less and less of our customers dealing with both of those really serious events at the same time.
Yeah, so it's another option for ransomware actors is this pure extortion play. Nick, I want to talk to you about something else that we cover in the report, and we did a large blog piece on this year, which is the leaking of ransomware source code. Some of this was done accidentally, some of it was done deliberately by various groups, and that has had some interesting consequences on the threat landscape. I wonder if you could touch on a few of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of continuing on what Lori was saying, we're kind of seeing a fracture in the landscape and two kind of divergent paths that are going on. So you have the one group that is the more sophisticated groups that are doing ransomware and extortion attacks, increasingly leaning on extortion and targeting your larger enterprises, right? But what you're also seeing is, because of all these source code leaks and builder leaks and open source alternatives, you're starting to see more and more small groups pop up. And they're kind of standing on the shoulders of those that came before them. They're not sophisticated enough to be able to write full ransomware from the ground up, but they are able to modify the stuff that's already out there, take the leaks and the builders that are there, and build their own infrastructure. What's interesting is their targeting tends to lean on the smaller side of enterprises. So they're also not pursuing extortion avenues as much and are much more heavily focused on ransomware. Again, likely because they're leveraging the tooling that already exists. There's a lot less open source and leaked tooling around exfiltration and data stealing. So as you can tell, the smaller groups are really taking to these builders, to these leaked source codes. And we're starting to see more and more ransomware groups pop up all over the place.
Yeah. Does that make attribution, for the security defenders, does that make attribution harder when you've got these smaller groups popping up and using other groups' ransomware code?
It does to some extent. The one advantage or disadvantage you do have is, because it is ransoming, there has to be some communication with the threat group. So your attribution from the outside might get a little cloudy, but from the inside, you should have a very clear grasp of what particular group is after you, because they'll be contacting you.
Yeah, absolutely. Dave, you mentioned the attacks on network infrastructure earlier. I've been talking to a few people about the report, and they do call out this as like the number one thing that going into 2024, we are quite concerned about. Advanced actors are attacking networking devices at quite a concerning rate. I wondered if you could give an introduction to this topic as we cover it in the report, and what we're seeing attackers doing in terms of like taking advantage of potential security weaknesses in these devices.
Sure. So there's been a real increase in targeting, as you mentioned, and it's easy to see why threat actors have flocked to this space. Network devices have a large attack surface. They can offer a way into the victim's network. They can act as conduits for sensitive network traffic. They're often vulnerable, so they're a prime target. And beyond that, there's no standard operating system. It's a bunch of custom firmware unique to the vendor. So there's no one-size-fits-all security solution. All that can impede organizations from detecting and monitoring abnormal behavior, like the wiping of logs or other evasive tactics. So that's maybe why we're seeing the big increase. Some of the security weaknesses we see these adversaries taking advantage of. First, it's credentials, whether they're compromised from brute forcing or password spraying, whether they're bought on the dark web, or whether they're targeting default credentials. That's a big one. Second is the targeting of vulnerabilities, both old and new. For new ones, after something's disclosed, you'll usually see a huge spike right after that disclosure. And for old ones, we still see them achieving a lot of success. It's hard to patch network devices, but you see how integral it is. And then finally, misconfigurations. Some devices aren't configured properly for maximum security, such as they're allowed to connect to untrusted networks or something like that. So you can see threat actors targeting that avenue as well.
Yeah. A couple of things to kind of call out about that is the old vulnerabilities. At the beginning of the report, in the top trends section, there is the most targeted and exploited vulnerabilities, and a lot of them are over 10 years old. So we are continuing to see threat actors going after vulnerabilities that have been out there for a very, very long time. I want to ask Nick a little bit about the what we're seeing threat actors doing once they've gained that initial access into these networking devices, because we're seeing threat actors installing malware post-compromise to establish some more footholds. Nick, could you talk a bit about what they're doing and what might be the threat actors' goals here?
So there's kind of two different veins of activity that we see here. So the nation state groups or state sponsored groups, they're typically trying to get on these boxes to establish a foothold. And this can include attacking it from the outside or pivoting from a system you've already compromised on the inside to move to these devices. They are incredibly, incredibly effective places to stay long-term, have a high amount of visibility in the network, and potentially be able to operate with large impunity. On the flip side of that, we see criminal organizations that are attacking it from the outside as a way to gain initial access. So this is where, and I'll say this again and again, please, please, please do not put the management of your network infrastructure on the internet unless you have to. And if you do, please, please, please apply ACLs. If you expose the management capabilities of these devices to the internet, only bad things can happen. So please, please, please don't do that. But the criminal adversaries, what they're doing is they're looking for an initial foothold. They're looking for a way inside, and then they're going to use that access they have inside to make their way into the network so they can start doing things like extortion attacks, ransomware attacks. They'll really use it as a way to really increase their access into a network, whereas nation states kind of use it as a place to hide.
Yeah. Is a potential play for them once they're inside a post-compromise activity to potentially sell that access to other threat actors once they're in?
That is absolutely a potential for something that you can see, especially on the criminal side of things. If they happen to find themselves in an incredibly important or juicy target, it is fairly common for them to look to shop that access, especially if they don't want to take the potential law enforcement or other attention that comes with launching attacks against some of these targets.
Yeah, I was chatting about this with a colleague earlier, and we sort of likened it to breaking into someone's house and then like putting that house on the market to sell it to someone else. But you've broken into the house, not through the doors, not through the windows, not through the traditional methods, but through the water pipes. As you say, these networking devices are kept away, and it's really, really important to make sure that they are kept up to date.
One final point on that as well, like, going back, I've been in this industry for 15, 20 years, unbelievably at this point. Going back, it used to be like a badge of honor for a network admin to have their core routers have an uptime of like 3 years. Now is no longer the time for that. That is an inherent risk and something that organizations need to resolve very quickly. Patch your devices. Don't be afraid to reboot them. They should be rebooted periodically just to make sure things are okay.
Yeah. Speaking of patching, Laurie has got a wonderful recommendation above her fridge. Laurie, maybe you could touch on a couple more recommendations for our audience when it comes to protecting their networks from these types of attacks.
Yeah, both Nick and David kind of touched on these as well, is, patch all the things. Patch. Sadly, we're still seeing customers come in with ransomware, and we find out that the initial access root cause was an unpatched switch with a year or 2-year-old vulnerability on it. So the patching, definitely you have to stay up on it. So please give your security teams the budget and the people they need to keep up with those activities. And then again, password strength, not reusing the same password or a weak password across all of your network devices, making them strong, making them unique, replacing them often. And, and then monitoring. That's a big thing. There's so much monitoring that companies have to do now. We're monitoring our EDR systems and our SIM and all the logs and all the alerts, but sometimes those network devices don't get roped into that monitoring as much as they should be. So again, it's kind of that well-rounded approach to keeping everything safe.
Absolutely. Dave, I want to talk to you a bit about the APT coverage in the report. I've got a couple of questions on that. I've also seen an audience question come in about this as well. So first of all, I'd like to, if you can kind of give an overview of that APT section, Dave. Advanced persistent threats do emanate from every part of the world. This time our research focused primarily on APTs operating in China, Russia, and the Middle East. So can you talk about the kind of the introduction to that and how geopolitical instability is also manifesting in APT activity?
Absolutely. So broadly, we see the complex and contentious geopolitical environment influencing the goals and the operations of APTs globally. Part of the reason why you can see maybe these massive geopolitical events reflected in spikes in suspicious network traffic. So I can use China affiliated APTs as an example. This year, we saw a big increase in the tempo and intensity of operations from these groups. Why is that? Geopolitics. As China's relations with the West and neighbors have worsened, spy balloons, sanctions, Taiwan, South China Sea, the intensity of their operations, potentially as a signaling, has increased as well. So you see things like those APTs targeting telecoms in sensitive areas like Guam. That allows for access to both high-value intelligence targets for espionage, but it also allows for potential disruptive attacks in any kind of conflict, given telecom's links to critical services and infrastructure. And that's similar for other nations as well. You can look at Russia with Gameradon. They're primarily targeting Ukraine or Western organizations that could assist in defending Ukraine. You look in the Middle East, that's one of the most complex geopolitical environments in the world. And now you have the Israel-Hamas war. That's only going to exacerbate things as an influx of actors resume or increase activity. So basically, any major disruption in geopolitics are going to play out in APT activity because it feeds intent.
Yeah. So the question from one of our audience members who is watching us on LinkedIn is, how should organizations adapt their cybersecurity strategies in response to these geopolitical influences? Would you be able to take that one, Dave?
Sure. I think for one thing, awareness is key. You got to stay up to date what's going on, and you have to evaluate your own security posture in relation to these geopolitical events that are unfolding. Does it increase your risk? If there's some sort of conflict, are you in any way, could you be involved? Could your products be involved? Could they even be involved in secondary knockoff targeting like you saw in a MEDOC type situation? So if you are, in fact, having increased risk, you have to take some mitigation strategies. You have to maybe even assume a not if, but when type of thinking. Do defense in depth, do segmentation, improve your credential access management, take all the steps to increase your security if that risk is increasing as well.
Absolutely. Nick, I want to ask you about this. So our Ukraine task force remains firmly in place as it has done since the start of the invasion. And we continue to help protect critical infrastructure in Ukraine from cyber attacks. Could you talk about some of the most prevalent APT activity that we've seen in that task unit this year?
So a lot of the activity that we see is concerned around access, trying to obtain access, and Gameradon or Gamma Radon or however you pronounce it, they continue to be one of the most active groups in that region, especially one of the more sophisticated groups that's doing more targeted level attacks, has higher level of sophistication, does things like geofencing to make sure that payloads are only delivered inside of Ukraine. Those types of threats are the things that we're seeing most commonly. That along with trying to figure out like initial access. So we see lots and lots of attacks, trying to get credentials, trying to drop commodity malware, figure out ways to get into networks to launch further attacks.
Yeah. And also, Nick, as Dave mentioned, the war that was ignited between Hamas and Israel in early October, it reminds us that, events with global consequences can evolve very quickly. How has this particular conflict affected cyber activity in that region?
Well, the one thing that I want to be clear about is the Ukraine-Russia war and the war between Israel and Hamas are not the same from a cyber perspective. The capabilities on both sides of the Russia-Ukraine war are far, far greater cyber focus than what we see out of the Israel-Hamas conflict. That's not to say we don't see cyber activity, but it tends to be more vigilante, activist, hacktivist type activity or occasional sporadic attacks here and there, not the widespread organized attacks like we saw at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Laurie, let's talk about the last section of the report, which is commodity loaders, some interesting things that they've been up to this year. So our research mainly focused on Quackbot, Ursnif, Emotet, TrickBot, and Iced ID. They seem to have the most impact in 2023, although certain things happened. So, from you observe the fact that various loaders contained updates that seem to be tailored for ransomware. So let's just focus on that for a second. Can you talk a little bit about how these loaders were tailored for ransomware this year? Oh, Laurie, you're on mute, sorry.
Sorry about that. So we're really seeing like an evolution of from these used to be banking Trojans, and now they've had to evolve. Things have changed in the environment. Things have changed security wise. People are onto them, so now they're evolving their tactics and really focusing on that ransomware and helping that ransomware delivery. We see Ursnif kind of remodeling themselves, and we're seeing them being used with Royal a lot. Quackbot, they've implemented reconnaissance tools into their system, so it's helping these ransomware actors come in and kind of stealthily be able to recon the network and know the lay of the land and plan their attacks now, instead of coming in blindly and kind of throwing that grenade in there.
Yeah.
Iced ID, they dropped 2 new variants where, they're kind of being used by initial access brokers and kind of selling those credentials to the ransomware actors. So we're just seeing that kind of evolution and change a lot in the last year. Of these old tools are kind of getting a makeover now.
Yeah, it's really kind of blurring things. These commodity loaders are very well resourced, and it's really kind of hard to tell the difference between these and the more sophisticated actors because they're one and the same to a certain extent. Nick, I want to ask you a little bit about Quackbot because in August, we saw that there was a major global law enforcement operation to take Quackbot down. I think somebody called it the Great Duck Hunt, which is a great name. But unfortunately, as we've seen, dismantling botnet infrastructure, it doesn't necessarily mean that these cyber criminals are going to cease to operate. They may, rebrand or join other groups. Can you talk a little bit more about how the threat of commodity loaders may persist long after, the botnets have been dismantled?
Yeah, especially in the instance of Quackbot, the operators behind some of these commodity loaders take incredible measures to protect themselves. They use crazy amounts of operational security or OPSEC to make sure that they're not identified. And what we saw in the instance of Quackbot was they were very, very, very successful in being able to take down the botnet, but arrested no one. And when you don't arrest anyone, they're still out there. And in the instance of Quackbot, they've been operating for decades. You just basically took all their revenue away. Now the actors and people associated with it are going to have to figure out other ways to make up that revenue. And that's basically what we saw the mechanisms and the ways that Quackbot used to be distributed that were exclusively used to distribute Quackbot now being used to distribute other things. And they became active again, actually before the takedown, but continued to operate post takedown as well. So that these actors are going to continue to operate. They're criminals. They still are going to crime, unfortunately. So if you don't arrest them, this is kind of what ends up happening. They're going to pop up again.
Yeah, criminals going to crime. So I have a couple of questions left, but just want to issue a reminder for our audience. Feel free to ask us questions as well, and we'll come on to as many of those as we can towards the end. Just pop your question into the comments or reply to the stream. So Dave, what does the Defender community have to be positive about heading into 2024? We talked a lot about, the major threats and the major concerns. What is there to be positive about?
Yeah, so a key theme I wanted to highlight this year is that as intense as threat activity has been and all the geopolitical conflagrations and everything else, in a way, it's directly proportional to the doggedness of the Defender community. And I've seen a real amazing collaborative spirit this year among Defenders, whether that's in longstanding groups like the Cyber Threat Alliance or the new Network Resilience Coalition, or whether it's Defenders going out, actually working with partners in effective regions to have a huge impact, like our Ukraine task force, or like a new project we recently just published about Project Power Up, one of the more impactful things I've seen while working here that we can talk about, where Talos helped stabilize the Ukrainian power grid against GPS jamming. It took a huge amount of coordination and determination to achieve that. And it just illustrates the commitment to me of the Defender community, which is definitely a bright spot, a positive note, and a reason for optimism.
Yeah, that is an incredible story that we CNN covered, and we have also got our own story on the Talos blog. So we'll drop a link to Project Power Up in the comments. Do take a look if you haven't read that incredible story yet. So I want to talk about recommendations. So I'm going to come to you all on this. What would be your main piece of advice to Defenders following the findings of the Talos Year in Review? Laurie, I'm going to come to you first on that one.
Patch. But really be prepared, be prepared for an attack, because if you do find yourself under a major attack, especially ransomware, there are going to be big things that you're going to need to do in your environment, like an enterprise password reset, which is a very, very large undertaking for most organizations. So make sure you have that plan in place. You know what you're going to do, where all your passwords are, who owns them, and have the tools like Microsoft Labs to kind of make that process easier. Have that ready now, because it's when poo hits the fan, it's going to make a big difference in being able to recover from that quickly and effectively. So getting those incident response plans and procedures in place. So
yeah, absolutely. Rehearse. Nick, what would be your advice for our audience?
One of them is don't sleep on the basics. So when you do have this type of incident happening, it's not going to be necessarily a piece of security technology that's going to save you. It's going to be the segmentation. It's going to be the access control. It's going to be the auditing. It's going to be the logging. Those are the things that are going to save you. So please, please, please don't sleep on the basics. Security technologies are super important, but you need to have a secure base and a good base in place so that you are prepared when this eventuality unfortunately happens.
Yeah. All right, the inventor of the turkey lurkey man himself, which we'll come on to, Dave. What would you like to say to our audience?
So one of the top initial access vectors we've seen this year was the use of valid credentials. So credential management is monumentally important. You want to use a very good credential management system. You want complex passwords. You don't want things that can be easily cracked. And, since these things are getting sold on the dark web, and no matter how complex they are, that can happen, try and institute multi-factor authentication anywhere that you can to help protect yourself.
Awesome. So we have had a question as a hashtag turkey lurkey man on Laurie's fridge. Dave, who is the turkey lurkey man?
The turkey lurkey man, I can give a brief preview. You'll have to listen to Beers with Talos to get the full story, but he's basically a new mascot that we've invented for Thanksgiving or maybe for the year in review. Maybe we're combining all that. And he goes around to the houses and checks to make sure that your turkey looks good. And if it does, he's appeased. And what else he does, we're still figuring it out.
Yeah, I'm assuming that made very little sense to anyone who hasn't listened to the latest Beers with Talos episode, but do check that out. That is a wonder to behold. I'm just having a look at some of our audience questions. Nick, I think I'm going to throw this one your way. This has come from LinkedIn. How is AI impacting security?
So there's a couple of ways that we're seeing it. First and foremost, and the way that we see it most actively abused is in things like lure creation. So your phishing messages, your spam messages are going to be better. They're going to be written better. They're going to be more alluring and more attractive to click on than they used to be. That's probably the biggest place where we see AI used. Actually, from my perspective, the way that I see AI's biggest risk is probably in organizations moving too quickly down that path and potentially having things like underlying training data or the model itself stolen by criminals. That is really the area where people need to watch, because that's where millions of dollars of value potentially could be stolen in the blink of an eye. So if you do have all these AI systems that you're up and running, please make sure you're securing them. Make sure you're protecting that model data. Make sure you're protecting the models themselves, because criminals are going to do everything they can to try and steal it.
Criminals gonna crime. All right. I think I see just one more question. Nick, I might throw this one your way first, but Laurie, I know that you do a lot of work helping our customers gain visibility. So first of all, Nick, in the report, we talk about how threat actors are using more defensive evasion tactics. I think this is referring to the MITRE attack section. So how can organizations gain more visibility into them? So how can organizations gain more visibility into attacks where there's more defensive evasion tactics taken?
A lot of it comes to setting up protection so that you can tell when things are happening. Like if they're doing things like wiping logs or turning off logging, you need to have logic in place to be able to say, hey, this box stopped logging. Why did it stop logging? Or all the logs were deleted. Why? You know, those types of things are going to really help you when it comes to that point. Because adversaries, their goal is to not be detected. So they're not going to download stuff off the internet. They're going to use the binaries that are already on the box. Make sure that you have detections in place to detect usage of lol bins. That is going to be one of the things they're going to use. They're going to use legitimate software. Make sure that you are aware of what remote access tools you allow on your network. These things are going to pop up when you see these types of attacks.
Yeah, absolutely. Laurie, anything that you want to add to that when you're helping your customers gain more visibility into the networks?
Yeah, it's just, you know, Nick really hit all the things, but it's really about kind of knowing what you have on your network, what should be there. And also, I had something in my head and I totally blanked out on it, but Nick really did a good job of covering kind of that visibility and knowing what's going on. We see so many times where those remote access tools are flying around the network and they just shouldn't be there. And most of the time it's adversary activity. So being able to block that and keeping an eye on those things that it's happening. So.
Yeah, you're only going to know what's weird if you have that baseline of knowledge of you know what is normal, so you can detect when it's abnormal.
Yeah.
All right, I think that is all the questions that we have. So my huge thanks to Dave, to Laurie, and to Nick for joining me today. Thank you to our audience for watching and for all of your questions. The 2023 year in review is now available to download, so do go and check that out. It is a smorgasbord of threat research. cs.co/Talos Year in Review. Until next time, thank you so much for joining us and take care.